If you look at tuition dependent institutions, public institutions, the margins on those businesses are harder. So they have less resources and are being at the same time being asked to do more. And so if there are companies, privately funded companies that can bring capital, expertise, processes, often at scale to bear, and they can do it cheaper, better, faster, that I think universities are almost obligated to explore these now.
That was James Sparkman, organizer of the P3 EDU conference and partner at Alpha Education. We had a fantastic conversation about how colleges and universities can partner with the private sector, and it felt a lot like an amazing Partnerships 101 course to me. Why partnerships are on the rise, what to partner on, how to structure the process, the lessons learned, how partnerships are changing, and what to be on the lookout for the future. I think you're really going to enjoy this. And after you listen, check out the p3.edu conference. It's this fall at Georgia Tech. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Connected College podcast. I'm your host, Elliot Felix. I've helped more than 100 colleges and universities change what they offer, how they operate, and how they're organized to enable student success. And if you're a leader in higher ed and you think that the silos and separations get in the way of student success, then this podcast and my book, The Connected College, are for you. We're here to learn and work together to bust silos, question tradition, and forge partnerships so that students feel connected to their college, their community, their coursework, and their careers.
I'm really excited to have James Sparkman from Alpha Education to talk about public-private partnerships, what makes them work, and how can we do them even better into the future. Welcome, James.
Thanks a lot.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got into higher ed.
So I've been in higher ed for a couple of decades, about a decade of it as an investor and operator in higher ed, and the last decade or more as an advisor, primarily helping traditional nonprofit public universities with a real focus around engaging with the private sector. And in that role around 2017, one of our contacts was George Mason University, and together we started a conference called P3. That's been a bulk of our work as well more recently.
I would love to hear some examples of how universities can engage with the private sector. What comes to mind? Just to make it concrete for folks.
So colleges and universities have been partnering with private sector forever, really. And if you think of a traditional college campus, they've outsourced food service and they've outsourced security. And some of the partnerships got bigger, particularly around infrastructure. So the term P3 is traditionally associated with development of real estate and physical assets, parking garage, student housing, sports stadiums, where the private sector comes in and plays a role as a developer, often brings their own capital in some shared risk return basis. And what we've seen, and the reason I think we play a bigger role as an advisor, and we started the P3U conference, was that these kinds of partnerships have moved over to the academic side of the house. OPMs helping market recruiting, and they're seeing that in student success. Done a survey for, I think, this will be our fourth time Chronicle of Higher Ed about partnerships with the private sector. And the first headline is that every year we do it, it's more than 70% of those surveyed. That's presidents, provosts, CFOs, and universities are saying these partnerships are growing. And then we're also seeing the categories expanding of where there's interest. So a lot of it was housing, energy, parking, moved into online. We then saw mental health and telehealth during COVID. And as you can imagine, we're now seeing interest in AI. How does the private sector play a role in that? It's an evolving space and one that is increasingly playing a role in many assets or many aspects of a college campus.
The idea that this has been happening forever, and maybe the low-hanging fruit was services, food service, security,
And then it evolved to infrastructure and real estate and the dorm, the stadium, the parking garage. And then the next frontier was academics, ed tech, OPMs. And now they're growing in breadth and depth and crossing state lines so that you can do telehealth and these kinds of things. I think it's interesting to think about that trajectory. And I wonder if you have a take on like why they're growing in number and in variety. What's driving that?
I think a number of factors. One, I think universities do a lot, and the mandate for what they're expected to do, the bar continues to rise. So online all of a sudden happened, and now I'm expected to serve a market I never was expecting to serve. Mental health crisis on campus occurred, and COVID occurred, and now we have new challenges to deal with. And at the same time, the fundamental economics of higher ed have not gotten better. So you have 100 universities that have a $1 billion plus endowment. But if you look at tuition dependent institutions, public institutions, the margins on those businesses are harder. So they have less resources and are being at the same time being asked to do more. And so if there are companies, privately funded companies that can bring capital, expertise, processes, often at scale to bear, and they can do it cheaper, better, faster, that I think universities are almost obligated to explore these now.
That scale piece is really interesting. And then being able to apply the best practices instead of reinventing the wheel, working with someone that's doing at a bunch of different institutions so that you're not like starting from scratch makes a lot of sense.
The other layer on this is also, frankly, competition. And I do think that's that you have some scale players now, traditional nonprofits and publics, even Southern New Hampshire, ASU, that are growing. And if you're a smaller school, how do I compete and offer all the services they offer? So
Right.
if someone can come in and do it, so that's part of the equation.
Yeah, that's interesting too, right? If you're a smaller school and you're facing a demographic cliff and a decrease in high school grads continuing into college, and now you can't recruit regionally, you have to recruit nationally. That raises the bar too in terms of what you have to offer. And maybe you need a partner to be able to do that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's true. Even just the student experience itself, from the moment I apply to the moment I graduate, the various services I expect or the way they're expected to be delivered. The other factor that we haven't really talked about, but is going to come is price too.
Right.
Is to be able to do this in an affordable way, and at scale, you can perhaps do that. It's much harder to bring price down at a small scale.
So that's like another way that the bar on expectations is rising, but the cost or the expectation for price is lowering at the same time, like creating that pressure. How can universities figure out what to partner on and find the right partner?
It's a good question. It's one of the reasons we started P3DU was we didn't think there were great forums for universities to get together to share where these opportunities exist and the challenges involved in them are, and share notes. Do you think networking with peers and learning from those that are further along in the journey, watching what ASU is doing,
Right.
is never a bad place to start. And then it gets more challenging, which is, all right, there's so many areas and so many vendors. I think, though, these happen best when they're a little bit organic, where a campus sort of determines there's some challenge that they need to meet. And then a partnership option is brought into that versus letting the partnership kind of angle drive it. Because I think every school needs to weigh, should I do this in-house or should I partner? It should be, you should always be open to both options.
It's like the classic build buy.
Build buy, exactly. But it starts better when, like, the schools, and I think about schools we've been involved with, that said, we know we need to go online. And that, like, we need to start serving the adult learner market. They're primarily online. How do we do that? And then break down, what are the various services needed to do that? And what are the costs involved in doing that? And then, okay, can we do that? Or is there a better path in partnering to get there? And I think that's the way it works best is when it focuses on the problem to solve first, and then
Right.
partnership's just an option there. And whether that's we need to lower or we have all these, courses that we need to offer and we don't have enough faculty, is there a course sharing model? Is it we have mental health issues? Can we do that? Should we hire a psychologist on campus and start a call center to do that? Or is there a partner who can do that? But when it gets to specifics, that's where I think we're trying to play a role in that, but conferencing and meeting with people and going to various events to see what's out there. A lot of this, though, is it's not just identifying the partner. It's also, and some schools are getting better at this, the sort of process of engaging and considering partnerships. We think that's where, particularly as these partnerships have moved on the academic side, where there may not be deal skills, just
Right.
or there isn't just a culture of closing deals and doing financial models and running complex RFPs. That's where I think there's more work needed to be done on that side. But the identification is just a piece of the puzzle.
It makes a lot of sense, like starting with the needs. So you're not letting the cart drive the horse. So you're not at the conference and seeing shiny new ed tech and saying, let's do that at
Yeah.
our college, when that may not be the most pressing problem, or there might not be the need there, or they might actually have internal capacity, but instead starting with the need and then using that to best structure the relationship and build the skills in creating the right deal. I would love to hear what you've learned so far in terms of how to structure those relationships and how to think through the tricky aspects. Like I'm imagining like intellectual property, the cost, the revenue, the risks, the roles and responsibilities. Any lessons learned there?
Yeah. I think building on what you were just saying, I think the first place to start, if you're considering partnerships as an option, is not let it be vendor driven. That this happens all the time in higher. There's some company meets a president or provost or some administrator or a dean. And the next thing you know, we're going to implement, and it's almost a recipe for failure. It can work, but we think specifics matter. And I'll get into some of those, but it's really the process. Identify the problem, get stakeholders engaged and as broad a group as possible that makes it a functional group. But really, particularly the longer the potential relationship, the more impactful the relationship will be, the more you need to get a group of stakeholders involved. And we think that's almost the most important thing, is to get the right group, do the homework and find out who are the players in the space, i.e., make sure it's a competitive process. That helps you in all sorts of ways. We think writing down what your needs are, and like, even if you're not required to do an RFP, the act of going through a formal process clarifies thinking and clarifies the needs. So a lot of doing those up front and that work up front makes, when you're down to details in the deal, you're in a much better place. Once you get to warranties and financial terms and termination provisions, at that point, some of this is, you do need that expertise. So, whether you have it in-house, you need a consultant to help, and then getting counsel involved and getting the right kind of counsel can be
Right.
both a burden and too much. But the terms, and this is where each deal is different, and we see this in higher ed all the time. You can get overwhelmed with and spend too much energy on things that are relatively small in terms of impact, but they seem important, and then leave some things open. And each deal is a little different. I hate to say that, but there isn't like one. I would say fighting over the nickel and dime over certain little things is not really worth it. That's where people spend too much energy doing that. The bigger thing is, are you aligned around outcomes? Are you aligned? Is your institution aligned around the partnership? If you have a leadership that's committed to it, a university leadership, and you have the ability to stay always in control of these relationships, That's much more important than the fighting over a 1% or a financial term, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also sounds when you're talking about bringing in stakeholders, it also sounds like, in addition to the value in articulating the needs in an RFP or otherwise, but just having some kind of governance process in place sets colleges, universities up for success because they have a structure in place for vetting vendors and reviewing terms and getting inputs and making decisions. If you're talking about a new LMS partner or a new OPM partner, if you have an IT governance process in place where you know how to get input from faculty and staff and university leadership, then you're ahead of the game, it would seem.
But you also don't face that, which happens a lot, where some small group has made a big decision and they face revolt or
Right.
some kind of rejection on the, wait, you did what? And then you're forced to start over. It also vets kind of cultural fit, which is in these shared governance institutions really important, is to make sure you got something that can land and not face some moment where, oh God, we forgot to include the faculty senate in the process and they're not on board. And now we just don't have the institutional will to see this through. Look, anything worth doing is hard always, whether it's a startup or a partnership or a new initiative on campus. It's always harder and take more work and take twice as long as anybody thinks. So being grounded and have the pieces aligned to see these things through to success is pretty important up front.
I love the idea that, like, even the phrasing, what you're trying to do is avoid a small group making a big decision. I think at the end of the day, it has to be a small group of people, but they have to have consulted with an appropriately sized set of people to gauge the cultural fit and to kick the tires and look at it from different perspectives.
Yeah, we've seen this when you get into these partnerships where we think that the line is when you get the bigger group, the better to help pick the partner. And then when it gets into the weeds on the deal, that's when you really, it's just by
Then you
efficiency,
focus it. Yeah.
you get a much smaller group.
And what are some success stories? What are some partnerships that come to mind for you where it was really transformative?
There are a number, and maybe if I were to think of the top of the list, Arizona State's relationship with Pearson, it's a great example of where Arizona State wanted to get into the adult learner market, needed some support and expertise in going to market, had a long-term revenue share partnership, got to a scale and was able to build in-house expertise and was able to phase out of the relationship. And now one of the biggest national online players is a great example of using the partnership as a catalyst for change, but not being permanently dependent upon it. And I think that relationship transformed what Arizona State is today. Now, I think there's a lot more to Arizona State than that. It's an amazing institution, but it's an example of a truly catalytic kind of relationship. There are actually a number of those around online where just simply that it's like the overnight change the scale. I think there are more examples on the infrastructure side. If you look at it, Ohio State had two partnership opportunities. One where they essentially outsourced their energy management, and one where they outsourced the parking garage management. These partnerships have had challenges, but the net result was that Ohio State ended up with $1 billion payday from those two arrangements. $1 billion with a B.
Wow.
Again, transformative in terms of the kind of restructuring of risk to the private sector with capital and an endowment for Ohio State. You can go in a number of other categories. In sports, the role the private sector has played and that continues to evolve, particularly for big D1 schools, the broadcast arrangements and the sponsorship arrangements, truly transformative to some of those bigger brand sports institutions.
Yeah, and the reshaping of conferences as a result based on those deals.
It's a category that just continues to evolve, and one that I think there'll be some more to come around that, obviously.
It's really interesting. And I like the point you made about the Arizona State Pearson as a catalytic partnership as opposed to one that's
kind of characterized by long-term dependence, because I feel like that's sometimes people's fear right there. You bring in this outside entity and then you don't build that capacity in-house, or it's like a forever relationship, whereas it can be successful if it has this trajectory where we're trying to catalyze this growth, then we're trying to build the capacity in-house, then we're trying to phase the partnership out where and when it makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a number of those. And again, you can go to there's a large list of some of those that are maybe in the early stages, but you're looking at there's some low cost degree models going on at Georgia Tech that started with IBM and Coursera as partners. It, I think you're going to see some more that again they're more like, and AI will let's see where that goes. So is there opportunities to maybe truly transform the cost of higher ed? Those are really interesting. There's some interesting opportunities where I don't see without sort of private capital and innovation how it's going to happen.
You mentioned that a lot of what's driving that is heightened expectations or responsibilities, whether it's mental health support or serving the adult learner market or going online. What do you see as like the next wave of new expectations for universities that might lend themselves to partnerships? Maybe AI
I'm
is
looking
the
forward.
is
I'm looking
yeah.
forward to that chapter in your book, Elliot. Look, I see them all the time where there's again timely care and mental health services, providing tutoring services. I think there are a number of players that are using technologies to do some particularly routine question answering or administrative things that are going to potentially lower costs. I think there's a number of ways that technology can simplify the student experience. And there's a couple of companies that you just talked to one CEO of one yesterday where there's simplifying the experience of multiple logons. And that, I mean, so technology actually made things more complicated and then maybe it'll make it more simple. I do think though, you're going to see hybrid is here to stay.
Yeah.
And even those that are in a fully residential environment are going to have opportunities to do things remotely. And it's in many ways mimics the workforce. I think that's probably, speaking of workforce, is probably the one area that I think you're going to see continually more evolution. And whether partnerships as outsourced providers play a role in this, or whether it's just organic connections between the workforce and higher ed. But I think there's a number of really smart and thoughtful folks trying to think of ways to make the higher education experience much more relevant to the job market, whether that's Carnegie considering skills as a method of degree versus time, or if it's more employer engagement directly with curriculum and platforms, not just connecting them like to find your first job, but integrating needed skills into the curriculum. I think there's a whole bunch of things that are going to happen around that. And if you look at some of the work that Burning Glass and others are doing where they're tracking things from the moment a student arrives at a university and then over time through their career, like that's going to be really interesting data that I think will be tracked and brought into curriculum decisions. I think they're going to get a lot better data and smarter around making these kind of alignment around when I pick a path, I know where it might be going. Versus me, I was the American Studies major, so I had no idea what I was going to do. So
A credit to a liberal arts foundation in critical thinking and communication.
there you go. Yeah. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I still believe in all that.
To pull on this thread, things that universities are trying to do at scale and that might have a seasonality to it, where the demand is pretty roller coastery, if that's a word, having a third party provider that can dial things up and down often makes sense. So I feel like things like success coaching are going to be areas for that, where you can do it at scale. And top 10 issues that students face are pretty common campus to campus, right? Getting oriented to the LMS,
or getting engaged. I think things like the student portal or a student engagement platform. I also think there's a lot happening around space management because campuses have realized that they're overbuilt. They've been adding spaces at a pace that's much faster than enrollment. And so there's lots of folks looking at how do we better utilize what we have so we grow in place instead of add new.
Mhm.
So there's all kinds of sensor companies and space analytics companies that are doing that and finding that, for instance, office space is 20% of most university campuses. And we just did a webinar yesterday where its peak utilization is in 40 to 50%. So if you're only using 20% of your campus half the time
Right.
at most,
Yep.
you, in theory, you have 10% growth capacity right there. Or maybe if depending on the economic climate and the location, those are stranded assets that could be sold or leases that you can shed and help you do more with less. So I think there's the
Yep.
opportunity there too. So final question, advice you have. I think you've been providing great advice in each question, a final chance to share your insights and advice for companies, for institutions on how to partner successfully.
There's so many partnership opportunities. Maybe I'll start with some of the bullets maybe covered. I think determining what your needs are is kind of most important, and partnerships are sort of an execution strategy. And partnerships are not a savior of any sort. I think they're one of your opportunities to execute on what you're trying to do. I don't really believe in outsourcing entirely. I think every institution really needs to understand if you're even in partnerships where literally you're saying, you go do this. I think universities need to have more people on campus who understand how to manage and understand the metrics of what those partners are doing to hold them accountable. My sense is there aren't enough project management and business management skills on campus, and I think you need to find the folks who have those. And a good example is if you're going to outsource things or partner with someone on marketing and recruiting to an online provider or even an agency, you better know all of the metrics to know, even if they're doing the work, you should know when they're doing a good job or a bad job. And I think that's the one thing that we see a little bit of blind. Okay, I've signed up a deal and they can do it.
Yeah, it's a little bit
And
of
that's
set
when
it and
people get
forget
in
it.
trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's the piece that, like, overall, I think active engagement is better for everybody. And it's better for the company because they feel like they truly have a partner, and there are going to be challenges and changes. And the more connected you are, the better you are to manage those. It's better for the school because they can always rationalize why they're in it, and they're always in a position to potentially move on and change if they need to. But at the end of it, it should be better for students and outcomes for students if you're keeping costs low and the output good in those relationships. Being knowledgeable about being active participants in any partnerships is important.
That's really good advice. And I appreciate all your insights and advice and what you're doing to help higher ed as a whole with the P3 EDU. And I'm looking forward to the next Chronicle survey.
It is going out shortly. Yes. And we do see it this fall at P3DU. But I'm also looking for your book.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Connected College podcast. Subscribe to my Connected College newsletter at elliottfelix.com for insights and excerpts from my upcoming book, tools you can download, and special offers. You can also find more information about talks I've given, articles I've written, and upcoming events there. And please support the podcast by rating and reviewing it wherever you're listening. Let's create connected colleges where students will succeed.